The early church father, St. Augustine, called the book of Isaiah the fifth gospel. Prior to the first four gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, being written, St. Augustine referred to Isaiah and his entire prophecy, Isaiah's entire prophecy, as the fifth gospel. And that makes sense because gospel means good news. And Isaiah was sent by God to speak good news into a dark world. He was sent by God to announce the coming of hope in a time of hopelessness. I've often said, especially inside churches, we hear the word gospel a lot. And you've heard me talk about the fact that growing up, I just assumed that gospel was for people outside the church, that it was synonymous with evangelism only, that it was people outside the church, it was non-Christian people who needed the gospel. But then once God saves you, he moves you beyond the gospel into something different, into something deeper. But as you read the Bible, what becomes very, very clear, and as you experience life, what becomes very, very clear is that once God saves you, he doesn't then move you beyond the gospel. He moves you more deeply into the gospel, that none of us ever outgrow our need to hear it is finished, ever. We need to hear good news continually, perpetually. We need to hear good news. And I've said that if it doesn't sound like good news, it isn't. Regardless of how many times we may use the word gospel, gospel-centered this and gospel-centered that, gospel-centered preaching, gospel-centered parenting, whatever the case may be, if it doesn't feel relieving, if it doesn't feel like it lightens our load, if it doesn't sound like good news, it's not the gospel. And so we need to hear gospel all the time because we live as broken people in a broken world with other broken people, a world that, as I'll show you here in a moment, Isaiah was speaking into as well. And we need to be constantly hearing good news. You see, in context here, the Assyrians, the enemies of God's people, the Israelites, were on the verge of taking over the promised land, and doom and gloom is on the horizon. I mean, it's just around the corner. The Assyrians are making their way toward God's people in the promised land, and they're mighty and they're powerful, and so God's people, the Israelites, are fearful. Understandably so. They're fearful. They begin crying out to God. They need help. They know that they cannot help themselves. What a great picture. They know that they cannot help themselves, and so they are crying for outside help. They're needing God to intervene. They're needing God, in a sense, to provide a magnificent intervention. Doom and gloom is on the horizon for God's people in context here. And we find ourselves in a similar situation. This is the way life feels to us too. I mean, just over the past month, including yesterday, we've seen our country's racial divide stirred up, and heated emotions are flowing, and it's so revealing of how broken and messed up our world is. It's so revealing of injustice and messed upness and all of those things. We live in a messed up world. And the reason our world is messed up is because we are messed up people. And so we find ourselves very much in the same kind of situation that God's people found themselves in here in Isaiah's day. I mean, many of us are daily reminded of financial fears and relational tension. We live in fear that our kids are going to go off the deep end, that we might be single the rest of our lives, that people might find out who we really are. This dark and gloomy reality, in other words, was not just back then. It's today. It's yesterday. It's tomorrow for us. This is our world, our country, our city, our family. This is you, this is me. And Christmas, for many people, brings out this brokenness, brings out this dysfunction. You see, Christmas is both joy and gloom. We tend to think of Christmas as the happiest time of the year. And in some sense, it really is. I mean, we love the decorations, we love the presents, we love the way Christmas feels, the Christmas season feels in so many different ways. We, for the most part, enjoy being around certain family members and friends and whatnot. I mean, most people would think, if you ask them on the surface, most people would say or would think that Christmas is a joyful time of year. But when you begin to dig beneath the surface, in the lives of other people and in your life, it's also a time of stress. It's not just excitement. It's not just joy. It can also be a time of stress because it's that time when budgets break, when you're reminded of how dysfunctional your family is. I mean, for some of you, this is your first Christmas as a divorcee. And figuring out how to shuffle your kids back and forth between your ex and you on Christmas Day is a brand new pain for you. You've never experienced that before. For others, you're afraid it will be your last Christmas because your health is fading fast. And some of you have received a diagnosis this past year that does not guarantee that you'll be around next Christmas. For others, you're afraid it will be your last Christmas with your mom because of her recent diagnosis, or your dad because of his recent diagnosis, a lost job, a daughter who won't even call on Christmas Day, a son you haven't talked to in 3 years, a father who can't get sober, a sibling in rehab. Christmas reveals and exposes in so many different ways our deepest frustrations and fears, our most sincere sadnesses and suspicions, our brokenness and our bitterness. Christmas is not just joy. It's also an expose of our brokenness. It also showcases our dysfunction, our pain, our sorrow in 1,000 different ways. In other words, the Christmas season has a way of revealing why Christmas was so necessary. And so this world that we live in and the doom and gloom that always seems like it's on the horizon for us in our lives too, the fear that marks our lives, the sadness that marks our lives, the dysfunction that marks our lives, the selfishness that breeds problems with other people that marks our lives. All of these things are the things that make life heavy and hard, that really make us cry out like the Israelites did here to God for help. Isaiah is describing our reality, in other words. Our life under the sun. It is tears, it is pain, it is confusion, it is fear, it is death. I mean, verse 5, Isaiah says, when he describes the boot of the trampling warrior in tumult, the garment soaked in blood, all of these things, the way that life feels bloody, the way that life feels like a constant battle. We can never seem to get to where we need to be, to where we want to be. We think that comfort is just around the corner, that security and safety is just around the bend. That if we can just keep doing more and trying harder, that we'll find the kind of peace and the kind of joy and the kind of happiness that we long for, but that always seems just out of our reach. This is the context that God speaks good news into. And this seems terminal. I mean, our deepest fears and problems and pains are out of our control. That's our real pain. The idea, as Zach mentioned a few minutes ago, that we can't fix our world. We can't fix our world. Electing the right person into office or establishing new laws and policies cannot fix what's really wrong with our world, which is the human heart, as Churchill said. The heart of the human problem is the problem of the human heart, and we can't fix that. You can't fix yourself. We can't fix our world. We can't fix other people. And that sense of not being in control, of not being able to fix what's wrong with us, with him, with her, with them, with it, the fact that we can't fix that, the fact that we can't ensure that life for us and our children and our friends and our family and all of that is going to go according to our infallibly written script. We can't ensure that. And that's what really brings the pain. That's what really generates the tears. If there is a solution, it must come from above the sun, or as Isaiah says here in verse 1, from the land beyond the Jordan. It has to come from outside of us. It can't come from inside of us. My heart has broken, absolutely broken, over the last month and the things that have transpired, the racial divides that have been exposed, all the way up until yesterday, up through yesterday, when 2 police officers were assassinated, essentially, in retaliation. I mean, all of this stuff. And what's so maddening to me is listening to both Christian and non-Christian commentators wax eloquent as if the problem can simply be solved if we just sort of instruct people, educate people, put new laws into place, put new policies into place. And I think to myself, you're completely missing it. I mean, literally, if our problem was political, God would have sent a politician. He didn't, okay? He came himself. Our problem is sin, and so he sent a savior for sinners. The problem, the heart of the human problem, is the problem of the human heart. It's not something that you can fix. It's not something that I can fix. It's not something that we can fix. It's something that only God can fix. It's something that God has promised to fix. And so this is precisely what Isaiah sees here. He sees the light at the end of the tunnel. Verse 1 and verse 2, Isaiah makes it clear that he sees a light at the end of the tunnel. He begins to see a figure appearing who will one day restore his people. He sees a rescuer, a leader, a redeemer, a savior. He looks beyond the darkness and sees the dawn of a new day. And it's in the face of this doom and gloom that Isaiah says, but to us a child is born, to us a son is given. And at this announcement, the whole mood changes, which it typically does when we hear good news. The mood changes. The darkness begins to fade. Light begins to shine through the clouds. And notice what he says here. The son is given, not earned, not deserved. This is one-way love at its finest. The son is given. It's into our mess that God delivers outrageous mercy. The son is given, he's not earned. And notice who the son is given to us. To those who are hopeless and burdened and broken and scared and weak. It's given to those who are in trouble. The son is given, not earned, to those who need help. I've said it before, God has never, ever, ever shunned someone who cries out to him for help. Someone who comes to him recognizing their brokenness and needing mercy. Never. God has never, it doesn't matter what you've done. It doesn't matter what kind of upbringing you had or how damaged and dysfunctional you are or how damaged and dysfunctional your family is. It doesn't matter just how deeply messed up you are. God has never, ever, ever turned away someone who crawls to him for help. Someone who comes to him asking for mercy. And notice what he says about this child. I love this passage. I revisit it every Christmas because it's such a beautiful description of this one who has come to save us, this one who has come to set us free, this one who has come to rescue us, this one who is promised all the way back in Genesis chapter 3, when God in a somewhat cryptic way announced that he would send a rescuer when he said that the seed of the woman would one day come and crush the head of the serpent. And I can imagine Adam and Eve during that time going, what? What does that even mean? And some of the people in the Old Testament, as they heard that story, going, I'm not exactly sure what that means. But as the Old Testament develops and builds, this promise begins to take on shape. and begins to take on more color, to the point where now here in Isaiah is being pretty descriptive. This seed of the woman who God promised would one day come and crush the head of the serpent, this rescuer that God promised who would one day come and clean up the mess that we made. He gives this person a description here. He says, this child is a wonderful counselor. This child is a mighty God. This child is an everlasting Father. This child is a Prince of Peace. The phrase wonderful counselor literally means the wonder counselor. I love that. I love that he comes and counsels wonder. That is his counsel. His counsel is wonder. Jesus comes as our supernatural counsel, which is wonderful compared to the way that we typically counsel ourselves. Okay, we counsel ourselves on a regular basis, if you haven't noticed. We are desperately trying to counsel ourselves through our problems and through our pains and trying to gain some sort of perspective so that we can live another day. And I found an example of this in our country's greatest news source, The Onion. I read this yesterday, a perfect example of the way we typically try to counsel ourselves, a counsel that is far inferior to the wonder counsel that Jesus offers. This is the headline: Man unaware that all his friends think of him when they want to put things into perspective. Okay, this is straight from New Jersey, okay. Listen to this. Friends and co-workers of local man Alan Tesler confirmed Wednesday that whenever they feel discouraged or depressed, they need only think of their 36-year-old acquaintance to put everything back into perspective, a fact to which Tesler, by all accounts, remains completely oblivious. Okay? According to sources, Tesler is unaware that each of his friends bring him to mind when facing personal obstacles, relational troubles, or a general sense of dissatisfaction with their lives, using the unmarried office equipment sales associate as a valuable reminder that they should be grateful for what they have. If I have a rough day at work or my wife and I get into a fight, I can always take a step back and be thankful that I'm not in Alan's shoes, longtime friend Daniel Carranza said of Tesler, who reportedly lives by himself, eats the same Chinese takeout meal most nights, and spends his weekends watching reality television competitions. Carranza continues, it really helps put my problems in context. All I have to do is invite him out to lunch and listen to him talk about his bad back or this new real estate investment idea he read about online, and I realize that I'm actually in pretty good shape. Just thinking about Alan helps me remember how truly lucky I am. As verified by multiple sources, with his dead-end career, lack of personal interests, and the frequency with which he still borrows his parents' car, Tesler has for numerous years unknowingly enhanced the self-esteem of almost everyone who knows him. Indeed, Tesler's acquaintances claimed that frustrations and anxieties concerning their own financial woes, health issues, and other difficulties invariably melt away simply by picturing Tesler sitting alone in his unadorned one-bedroom apartment or going grocery shopping on a Friday evening. Okay? Now, it's silly, but The Onion has a remarkable way of really cutting to the heart of what every single one of us experience at some level. I mean, we counsel ourselves. We're constantly counseling ourselves. One of the ways we deal with the pain and the problems in our life is to just think about someone else whose problems are worse. And that makes us feel better. But that quickly fades away. That doesn't last forever. The counsel that Jesus offers lasts forever. He's a wonder counselor. He's not just addressing our felt needs. He comes to address our real needs. He does not simply provide Band-Aid solutions. He doesn't simply come and provide pat answers to eternal problems. He comes to sacrifice himself on our behalf, to stand in the gap, to take on himself the punishment that we deserved, and then give to us for free all of the perfection that he earned, so that we could experience joy and peace and security and affirmation from God forever. That's the only kind of counsel. This is why I've said, if you're going to counsel yourself at all, preach the gospel to yourself every day, because you forget it every day. I forget it every day. Luther said that. Martin Luther said that. He said, I have to preach the gospel to my people every week because they forget it every week. And then I have to preach the gospel to myself every day because I forget it every day. That's the only counsel that actually helps. And Jesus is the embodiment. He is our wonder counselor. He knows everything about us. He knows what you need. Your hopes and your fears, your dreams and your longings are not anonymous to Jesus. It's amazing to me. We say these kinds of things like, your hopes and your fears are not anonymous to Jesus. Go to him. He helps those who need help. And if you grew up in church or you grew up in the Christian environment, and you hear something like that and you're like, yeah, that sounds good. Do you understand how amazing that is? I mean, if people knew us the way God knows us, they would run away. God knows us, and he loves us, and he stays with us, and he promises to never leave us. That anchors our lives in a way that nothing else can. That nothing else can. People will come and people will go. God stays. God never leaves us. He never forsakes us. So our hopes and our fears, our dreams and our longings are not anonymous to Jesus. And when you go to him, he counsels you wonderfully by reminding you that he has come to do for you and secure for you what you could never do and secure for yourself. Mighty God literally means God is a warrior. That's what it literally means. That God is a warrior. He comes as a conqueror of sin and death and slavery. He comes to destroy joylessness and fear and loneliness. He comes to wipe away our tears by dying. He's a mighty warrior. He comes to crush the serpent's head, and in doing so, he eliminates and eradicates pain and frustration and joylessness and loneliness and fear. God is a warrior. He comes to conquer sin and death and slavery. He's a mighty God. He's not just a wonderful counselor. He's a mighty God, but he's not just those things. He also comes as an everlasting Father. He not only protects like a good father should, but he also provides. He provides. He provides all that our hearts long for, love and meaning and approval and security. And notice, he's not just any kind of father, he's an everlasting Father. He provides these things forever. In other words, no matter what we do or fail to do, we can never ever wiggle our way out of what God, the good, everlasting Father, provides for us. Love, meaning, approval, security, those things that drive us, those things under the surface, those things that prompt just about all of our pursuits. The hunger for love, the hunger for meaning, the longing for peace, the longing for joy, the things that drive us. And God says, I've got this. You could never in 10 million years provide those things for yourself. So I came to provide those things for you. And once I give to you, I never take from you. These are the things that will establish your heart forever. He comes as an everlasting Father, but then finally he also comes as a Prince of Peace, which literally means, I love this, the administrator of shalom. The Prince of Peace, the administrator of shalom. This idea that he comes to set things straight. He is the one who comes to clean things up. He is the one who brings restoration to our lives and to this world. Jesus came to fix what is broken, to bring light into our darkness, to bring beauty out of ashes. He comes to do all of these things. So Christmas not only exposes our desperation, but it also announces our deliverer. Christmas time exposes our desperation. It shows us, it reminds us in some pretty acute ways that us and the world that we live in is messed up, but it also announces an amazing deliverer, the one who promises rest to the weary and heavy laden, the one who promises never to leave us or forsake us. For those who feel lonely and lost, anxious and abandoned, tired and tense, for those who are guilt-ridden and grieving, Christmas is for you. Especially for you. The incarnation of Jesus is the fulfillment of God's promise to confront our misery with his mercy, our confusion with his comfort, our guilt with his grace. You could put it this way: Christmas is the beachhead of God's campaign against sin and sadness. It is the coming of light and life and love into the occupied territory of darkness and death and hate. He is our answer. He and he alone is our solution. Christmas sets in motion the divine pattern of God drawing near to us, not because we've done it right, but because we keep doing it wrong. In other words, at Christmas, God didn't come our way, do what he needed to do, go back and say, okay, I've done this much, you do the rest. That's not the way God operates. Christmas sets in motion the divine pattern of God drawing near to us. In other words, the way God came to us the first time is the way God continually comes to us. He doesn't come to us once and say, I've done my part, now you do yours. I've come to sort of, wipe the slate clean, but you are now responsible to make sure that what that clean slate is full of at the end of your life is good stuff that you've done. That's not the way God works. Christmas sets in motion the divine pattern of God drawing near to us, not because we've done it right. We weren't doing it right. God didn't come the first time because we did it right. He came the first time because we were doing it wrong. We were the ones who got ourselves into the mess that required God to come in the first place. And that's the way God continues to relate to you and me. It's not just a one and done for God. We look back and go, one and done. No, this is the way God works. This is the way God relates. Christmas it sets in motion the divine pattern of God drawing near to you, of God drawing near to me, not because we're clean, not because we're doing it right, but because we're dirty and we keep doing it wrong. God continues to come. Christmas is that wonderful promise that this is the way God relates to people like you and me. He comes. God comes down over and over and over and over again. Jesus came down to us because we are weak, not because we are strong. I don't know if you understand how paradigm shifting that is. I mean, that is a big, big deal. To think of Christianity that way instead of the way you probably heard growing up, at least the way I heard growing up. No one ever said this. No one ever said these words to me, but the impression I got was that Christianity is for good people, clean people, strong people, moral people. That's so antithetical to what the Bible actually says. And it's so antithetical to Christmas itself. That the reason Christmas is good news is because we're bad, not because we're good. The reason Christmas is good news is because we're dirty, not because we're clean. Because we're broken, not because we're fixed, because we're weak. not because we're strong, and God continues to relate to us in that way. Christmas highlights the inescapable fact that no matter how hard we try, we can't do it. Apart from the incarnation of Jesus, we are left to our own bankrupt resources, but at the same time, it shows us Jesus. It shows us Jesus who came to liberate us from the pressure of having to find peace and joy on our own. He came to set us free from the need to secure for ourselves the affection and the approval that we long for but can't attain no matter how hard we try. Christmas, in other words, is God's answer to the slavery of self-salvation. That's what it is. Christmas is God's answer to the slavery of having to find life on our own, find peace on our own, find happiness on our own, find security and safety on our own. This is God's shout that he has the whole world in his hands and he has got our lives under his gracious control. Christmas is God's shout that Jesus came to clean up the mess that we made, that while our sin reaches far, his grace reaches farther. Christmas is God's answer to the slavery of self-salvation. So from the cries of a baby lying in a manger, God yells, "I've got this." I've got this. Cries that can't be understood, no words spoken, but from the cries of a baby lying in a manger, God is yelling, God is shouting, "I've got this, I'll take it from here." It is this crying baby that wipes away our tears as our wonderful counselor. It is this powerless child that conquers despair and dejection as our mighty God. It is this needy newborn that is the source of everything we need and long for as our everlasting Father. It is this helpless infant that restores okayness to our lives as our Prince of Peace. That's who he is. That's who he is for you. That's not just who he is generically. That's who he is for you. That's who he promises to be for sinners like you and me. As everything, he became nothing so that you, as nothing, could have everything.